al terzo appuntamento del ciclo organizzato da Castelvecchi di incontri all'interno di IPER Festival delle Periferie, diretto da Giorgio De Finis. È una collaborazione che appunto ci accompagna già da 3 anni e quindi siamo molto contenti di questa occasione. Questo è il terzo appuntamento. Abbiamo avuto finora Leonardo Boff, teologo della liberazione, e Christu Passabolius, filosofo lituano, e oggi c'è qui con noi dalla Germania Fabian Scheidler, che è autore di un libro che abbiamo pubblicato proprio di recente, che io definirei un libro monumento, La fine della megamacchina, storia di una civiltà sull'orlo del collasso, ed è un libro veramente mirabile perché racconta la storia di 5.000 anni, diciamo, di umanità attraverso questa categoria della megamacchina che esemplifica proprio la realtà storica degli umani e del loro modo di far emergere, cammin facendo e affrontando soprattutto nella seconda parte gli ultimi 500 anni del capitalismo moderno, e quindi di quello che noi in quanto viventi abbiamo prodotto nel corso della storia, con tutte le sue convulsioni, le sue disuguaglianze, i suoi disagi, i suoi limiti, ma anche però le sue risorse, perché la cosa bella di Fabian Scheidler è che non ci fa precipitare diciamo in un nichilismo, ma ci offre, diciamo, delle chiavi di lettura per guardare al presente e al futuro anche con originalità. Allora questa grande avventura nella storia umana attraverso la figura della megamacchina è proprio lo sguardo che oggi Fabian ci offre qui a IPER Festival, e quindi io sono lieta di dargli il benvenuto e gli lascio la parola, e grazie a voi per essere qui.
Mille grazie Cristina, è un onore di essere qui a Roma a presentare il libro. Il mio italiano è limitato perché per quello parlo in inglese con la traduzione. As Christina has said, the book is about 5,000 years of history, and when I was about to write the book, I was asked, 5,000 years, isn't that too much? Such a long history, can't you be a little shorter? And I said, well, 5,000 years of history is not that much if you compare it to the existence of modern humans, Homo sapiens on planet Earth, about 300,000 years. 5,000 years is not much. It's what we call history, interestingly, although it's only a little part of human history. We call it history because history is written from the perspective of hierarchical systems of domination, and that's what the book is about. It has 2 parts. The first part is about the emergence of the first systems of domination, the first states, around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. And the second part is about the modern world system, what I call the mega machine. Now the subtitle in English, it's difficult to translate, is a brief history of a failing civilization. And I think many of us feel that this civilization is failing indeed. I just want to give you some examples. We've known about climate change for more than 50 years. Our governments have known about it. Yet our governments and corporations are drilling all over the planet for new fossil fuels. And we are approaching tipping points in the Earth system, which could lead us to a new state of planet Earth, which is called by climate scientists hothouse Earth, which would mean that 5%, 5 degrees centigrade plus, and that would mean large parts of the world could become uninhabitable. But if we pass these so-called tipping points in the Earth system. Another example, it's not only about climate, often it's reduced to climate. We have a biodiversity crisis. Industrial civilization has triggered the largest mass species extinction for the last 65 million years. There were 5 big extinction events in the history of planet Earth, 4 billion years, and we have triggered the 6th one. And still we are subsidizing in Europe, for example, industrial agriculture, which is one of the main factors of biodiversity loss. Another example, we have a grotesque level of inequality on the whole planet. 8 people today possess as much as the poorer half of the world's population. The big tech moguls, Silicon Valley, Jeff Bezos, those folks, they have doubled their billions, their fortunes in the pandemic while the rest of us were struggling. So we have these huge inequalities, yet our democracies have failed to do anything about it. Instead, many of our politicians of almost all parties have been even complicit in the race to the bottom. And that's why we have these, an extreme loss of confidence, of trust in our political system, and voting behavior goes crazy. So, and now we have a situation with the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, where our governments spend even more on the military than ever before. Humanity spends more on the military than it has ever before, while we need that money for social and ecological transition. So we are really in a difficult situation, and I could go on with that for a little while. I think you see the point. It is a failing civilization because it seems to be unable to address the crisis in which we are in. And now when a person acts in a crazy manner, or just let me say that before, if an alien from outer space would come to planet Earth and watch all this, he or she would certainly say, well, that's insane, that's mad, that's crazy what you're doing. And when a person acts in a crazy manner, it sometimes helps to tell his or her story, to understand why he or she is doing what he or she does. And the same is true for social systems. And social systems are made of humans, also the mega machine. So that's what the book is about. It's about a biography of a civilization, of its institutions, of its power structures, its ideologies, and even its psychology. However, when we look at our media, we get quite a different picture. What? No. What has happened now? I think something has gone wrong with the presentation. Okay, we'll try again. I think it doesn't work. Ah, now it works. Yes, perfect. Now, if we look at our media, we don't get this type of synopsis. We get unrelated news bits. There might be a glacier melting here, there might be a war there. It's completely unrelated. But what I try in the book is to put these pieces together and try to see whether a coherent picture emerges. And so the book is about the elephant in the room, if you will, that we are not talking about, because we're only seeing bits and pieces. We don't see the whole picture. Now, what is the elephant in the room that I tried to talk about? Well, that's my first thesis about the mega machine. And the thesis is that all these crises which I mentioned have a common systemic root, and that is a specific social system that emerged 500 years ago, in Italy, by the way, in the city-states of Genoa, Venice, Florence, and so on, in long struggles. It became extremely violent. It spread over the whole earth in an extremely violent way. Around 1900, it encompassed the whole planet, the first social system ever to do so, and it is steering us now into these unprecedented crises. Now, this system has had many different names. It's been called modernity, or Western civilization, or capitalism, or the modern world system, and I use the term the mega machine, which has been coined by Louis Mumford 50 years ago. Now, what is the mega machine? It's, of course, an extremely complex system. I just want to give you some aspects in a nutshell. It's based on 3 pillars. The first pillar is the endless accumulation of capital, which in an endless cycle of profit and reinvestment. This is completely new in world history. There were many empires which were based on violence and injustice, but it's the first system that is based on the endless accumulation of capital, and this is deeply enshrined in our most powerful institutions. For example, the joint stock company. I will talk about it later. The 500 biggest corporations today control 2/3 of world trade and 40% of global GDP. They're really the motor of the system. And they have, in their very construction, only one goal, and that is to multiply the money of the shareholders. There's no other goal, no social, no ecological, no ethic goal. It's only to multiply the money in eternity. And that is the reason why the system has to grow. It has to grow forever, otherwise it doesn't work. When we don't have growth, interestingly, we have a crisis. But growth is not only about money. Growth is about producing things. And in order to grow, producing ever more stuff, the system has to transform nature into commodities at an ever faster pace. That is why we have to throw away our cell phones every 2 years in order to keep the system running. Now, of course, a system that cannot stop growing is a problem on a finite planet, and that's where we are with the ecological crisis. Now, this first pillar cannot work for itself. There needs to be a second pillar, and that has been historically the modern state. Now, whatever you have learned about free markets on the one hand and the state on the other hand, forget about it. They are not separate institutions. Markets and the modern state have emerged in a co-evolutionary manner. One cannot exist without the other. Now, the early states in the 15th, 16th century, they were basically military institutions. 90% of the budgets were for mercenaries and firearms, which played a crucial role in early capitalism. But the problem was that the sovereigns didn't have the money to buy these very expensive firearms and mercenaries, which were the basis of their power, so they had to get the money somewhere. And what did they do? Well, they asked the merchants and bankers in Genoa and Florence, the Medici and others, to give them money to make war. That's what they did. So they bought mercenaries, they bought firearms to make war on other countries, and they plundered these countries, they looted these countries, and from the loot they paid, as we would say today, the return on investment for the bankers and merchants in Genoa, Florence, Amsterdam, London, wherever. So that was the motor of the war machine in early modernity, already with the 100 Years' War, then with the 30 Years' War. And it was also the motor of the colonial expansion. It was all based on debt. Columbus, Pizarro, all these people, they were deeply indebted with the banks in Genoa. So they had to get the gold and the silver from the Americas to pay back their debt. It was all based on debt. Now, another example of how states and corporations and the market were intertwined is the history of the joint stock companies. The first joint stock company was created 400 years ago in Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company. And it was very interesting that these institutions were created by the state. They were granted monopolies by the state. Capitalism is all about monopolies. Forget about free markets. It has been about monopolies from the outset. Look at Facebook, look at Google. So the Dutch East India Company had a monopoly, and they had their own army. They were like states, these early corporations, and with their armies they conquered the world. They were crucial for the colonization of the Americas, North America, of Africa and Asia. The British East India Company even ruled over India for hundreds of years. It was like states. And to give you just one example of how these companies operated, I will tell you the story of the Banda Islands, which I also have talked about in the book. In the Banda Islands in Indonesia, there were nutmegs. And nutmegs could be sold in Europe for very high prices. So the Dutch East India Company wanted to have a monopoly on nutmegs. But the people on the Banda Islands said, well, we don't want to give you a monopoly. We want to trade with China as well. So the Dutch took their army, their mercenaries and firearms. They invaded the Banda Islands, and within just a couple of months, from the original 15,000 people, 1,000 were left. So this is one of the many genocides that were connected to the expansion of these companies. You can tell lots of stories like that in Africa, North America, and elsewhere. And at the same time, Amsterdam became the most famous, the richest, most liberal city in Europe, splendid city. And the people who invested in the company didn't even know what happened at the other side of the world. So that's part of capitalism. People invest and they don't know how their money is multiplied. Now, we have these two pillars, but no social system, and especially no violent and unjust social system, can rely only on these two pillars. There needs to be a third pillar, and that's ideology. So we need somehow to legitimize the system, and something that has been crucial from the outset for the legitimation of that very system has been what I've called the myth of the West. This is an image that is symbolizing the colonization of North America. And so you see that person with a school book, and you see trains are coming, electricity is coming, and the barbarians in this view are fleeing. Now, the myth of the West tells us a narrative about the West having the best of all religions. It's the greatest of all possible civilizations. We have the best economy, the best technology, the best science, the best political system. So we have a right and even a duty to evangelize and conquer the world. And this story has been going on for at least 500 years, even longer. At first it was Christianity that was used to justify the violent expansion. We had the true religions, the other were pagans. Later in the 19th century it was civilization. We are civilized, the others are savages, uncivilized. We have reason, the others are irrational. We have progress, the others are stagnating or going backward. After World War II, we have development. They are underdeveloped. And when you listen to any speech of major politicians, they are talking about Western values. We have Western values. The rest are more or less barbarians. So all this narrative, of course, is in stark contrast to the brutal reality of European expansion, war, genocide, and ecocide. And that was not only going on in colonial times. After World War II, Western government engaged in more than 100 illegal coups d'etat around the world. So neo-colonialism is almost as brutal as formal colonialism. Now this system, as I mentioned earlier, is in dire straits. So we are hitting limits. And I now want to speak a little bit about these limits, and I want to mention 4 limits which are also aspects of transition. And this is also my second thesis, that the system as it is reaching limits, and in fact we are already in a chaotic transition phase to something new and unknown. Now the first limit is the end of Western hegemony. So I talked about 500 years of Western hegemony, and it's going to end, it's about to end already. The system has known so-called hegemonic cycles for the last 500 years. It was first the Spanish Empire, financed by the banks in Genoa, then the Dutch Empire, then the British Empire, and the US Empire. But what is going to end now is not only the US Empire, it's ending. But it's more than that, it's the whole cycle of Western dominance that is coming to an end. We see that with the rise of China. China is a different kind of actor. It has a different history, it has different traditions. And China is outpacing the US already in economic terms. Not only China, the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and the rest of them are outpacing the G7. When you look at population, NATO countries have about 12% of the world's population. G7 countries have only 10% of the world's population, yet we think they speak for everyone, but that's not shared in the world. When you look at it in military terms, the US has by far the largest military in the world. They spend more than 1 trillion euros or dollars per year for their military, yet they are not able to win wars. They lost the war in Iraq, they lost the war in Afghanistan, they lost the war in Syria. And now we have in Ukraine a war after the Russian invasion, which is in part also a geopolitical war between the US and Russia, and the US is losing again. So militarily, they're not able to call the shots as they used to be. And also in ideological terms, the myth of the West is collapsing as we speak. The West is no model anymore. It is internally divided, not only in the US, but also in Europe. It has crumbling infrastructures in many countries, and the American dream is dead. And the whole narrative of progress, which was so important for the West, whether for the left or for the right, the idea that we and our children will have better lives later on is collapsing. Nobody believes that anymore. So it's not a model anymore. And the second point I look ideologically is that in the world, people outside Europe and the US perceive more and more the kind of double standards and double speak of the West. We have that with the war in Gaza now. The West is always claiming to defend international law and international order. Now we have a war in Gaza with an Israeli government that has already killed 35,000 people, more than 14,000 children. The International Court of Justice, the highest court in the UN, says it's a plausible case of genocide, yet our governments are still supporting the Israeli government. And in the Global South, most people think that this is double speak. These are double standards. Do we defend the international law or not? So that's